Let us now speak of the Houston Rockets with second-time guest Jackson Gatlin of Locked On Rockets and the Locked On National NBA show. How you doing, man?
Doing great, Nate. Excited to be back on the program. Excited to talk. Always excited to talk Houston Rockets basketball, especially with them positioning themselves as contenders this season. I'm sure that's going to be a topic that we'll broach as we navigate this conversation. Are they still contenders given the Fred VanVleet situation and all that jazz? So it should be a really fun conversation, man.
No, definitely. And a year ago, I think we both had them kind of in the low 40s. You might have been mid 40s, if memory serves. They well exceeded that to be the 2 seed. Probably actually could have won another game or two had they not taken their foot off the gas towards the end. And then, though, lost in a 2-7. A mild upset. Maybe some people would have favored the Warriors in that one. But anytime the 2 seed loses, it can be a little bit of an upset, to be sure. As you look back on last year, and we'll talk obviously about what they did to fix these things and also what really worked for them and whether that's going to continue. But what stands out to you about that performance that landed them the number 2 seed a season ago?
Yeah, I think that this team when Ime Udoka was hired, we knew that the Rockets would become, over time, that they would become one of the NBA's best defenses. And that's exactly what they did. Their year one with Ime Udoka, they finished as the 10th best defense in the NBA. Last season, they finished the 5th best defense in the NBA. And I think that trend is going to continue upwards. I fully expect them to finish as probably a top 3 defense, no worse, this year in the NBA. And so they've adopted that defense first mentality from Ime Udoka. And we saw that on full display last season. We also saw, a number of the different young guys taking significant steps forward. We saw year 2 Thompson, where he took over the starting role for Jabari Smith Jr. We did see a version of Jabari Smith Jr. that started to look really good before he had that hand injury that sidelined him for almost 2 months of the season. Alperen Sengun took some strides significantly on the defensive side of the floor. However, he did regress offensively. Won't spend a bunch of time talking about Jalen Green because he's, a non-factor now on this team as one of the pieces going out for Kevin Durant. But essentially, it was another step in the right direction for where this team needed to be going after, that year one with Ime Udoka, kind of putting in those foundational blocks of, getting this team back to being, playing winning basketball, at least 500 basketball that first year, and just kind of building off that success from that first season. And I do think that when you look at their series against the Warriors, a lot of people looked at the Rockets and said, they're not a real 2 seed, they're a fake 2 seed. I don't think that's fair to categorize them as a quote unquote fake 2 seed from last season, because they had legitimate wins against the Thunder, the Cavs, the Knicks. Like they beat all the good teams. They beat all the contenders multiple times, last season. And they were one of the best teams in the NBA all year long. They just drew like such a bad hand in the first round because the Warriors played like a top 4, top 5 team post Jimmy Butler trade. And so to draw them in the first round as your first round opponent, it's a tale as old as time. Warriors beating the Rockets, unfortunately, but it was a massive step in the right direction, and it gave them, I think, the confidence to go out this offseason and pull the trigger on a blockbuster deal like the Kevin Durant trade, because they felt that, they were potentially a KD away from being able to legitimately contend for a title.
Yeah, and I did think that ultimately Houston was not that close to Golden State. Like Jimmy Butler got hurt, but they did go down 3-1. Golden State didn't try in game 5. Game 7 ended up not being close. And the big problem, of course, was they just couldn't score outside of those double big lineups, which so dominated in limited minutes in the regular season, and then were one of their foundational things in the playoffs. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. I mean, the biggest thing that stood out to me, though, like the identity of this team, you started to hit on it, is that it wasn't necessarily their half-court offense. Their half-court offense was bad a season ago, and unfortunately they got Kevin Durant to try to address that. But in all the floor game aspects, they were really good. They're really good in transition. They forced turnovers. They were the best offensive rebounding team that we've seen in over 10 years. And going back, the 11-12 Bulls was the last team that offensive rebounded as well as this team did. And I think that the double big look is something that a lot of teams are trying to copy, including the Rockets, by adding yet another big in Clint Capella, who hits the offensive glass really hard. But that was the thing that stood out to me, is just they're a bitch to play against. every night. They were young, they're athletic, and that really is, particularly in a regular season setting, can be worth so much. And also they had a lot of depth. Even when someone like Fred VanVleet went out, they're able to be over 500 in his absence. So I guess maybe that's something else we could talk about too briefly, is what it looked like for them without Fred VanVleet. And maybe we can try to imagine that with Kevin Durant in that Jalen Green role, with Fred obviously going to miss the season with the ACL tear.
Yeah, I mean, just one more, just to your point, really quickly about
Sure.
they were a bitch to play against. At times I did kind of worry that there was a level of almost diminishing returns on their play style, because you kind of see the same play style, but obviously on a much smaller scale with like the bad teams in the NBA, right? The lottery bound teams, where it's like you get a young plucky team that they just play harder than you, right? They don't know how to play the game. They're not, maybe they don't have the most talent, or they're not very skilled, or the sets aren't crisp or clean, and they're messy, but they just try hard, and they're just physical, and they're just energetic. And it felt like the Rockets were like the 99th percentile version of that, because the half court offense was abysmal. Like their half court offense was worse than the Blazers and the Jazz last season, but it didn't matter because they were just so much bigger.
Now that's
and
first
stronger.
shot half court offense, but
first shot.
To be clear, the offensive rebounding made up for.
Oh, absolutely. But
it was real ugly.
Their whole offense was propped up with the offensive rebounding. Like that's the crazy part. And I mean, the running joke was sometimes just get the ball up on the rim, because the second attempt is better than the first one for the Rockets offense last year. And so I think that there is something there. We are going to talk about this more for sure. Is that the double big lineups, the size that they've fully committed to and like tripled down on this season, isn't an aberration. It's not a fluke. I think there's legitimately something there that they found that can be a consistent source of an advantage for them. But with the Fred VanVleet stuff, last year they lost Fred. He missed 19 games. He had a stretch where he missed 16 straight games. And it was that window where Jalen Green took on an even bigger role as the primary initiator of the offense. And then Ime Thompson was tasked with really taking on a lot more on-ball reps and responsibility, much more than he ever had in his Rockets career up to that point, despite having been primarily an on-ball player for his entire career before being drafted by the Rockets. He got to Houston and he just frankly wasn't ready at the NBA level to be a primary facilitator, to be a creator in the half court, that kind of thing. Looked really rough around the edges his rookie year. And so they played him in this ancillary role. They played him as a screener. They played him off ball. They used him as a cutter. They played him out of the short roll, like so many different ways that they utilized him. And I think that window with Fred missing time and Amin really leveling up his, by necessity, his on-ball reps, gave them a little bit of the confidence to be like, okay, we're feeling good about the direction that he's headed. And, that probably helped them, with some of their decision-making about moving on from who was their second primary playmaker in Jalen Green as part of that Kevin Durant trade, knowing full well that they would move Ime Thompson to that second guard spot next to Fred VanVleet. Obviously the big storyline is no Fred VanVleet now for, we won't call it a season-ending injury yet. It hasn't been reported as a season-ending injury yet. I know, dude. Let Nate just let me have the copium, man. Come on, like I don't know.
Well, especially even if he comes back in June and he's just going to drop right into like NBA Finals level of basketball.
I mean, there's not a ton of precedent for a 6 or a 7, 8 month ACL recovery, but at the same time, like, if he did in some capacity make it back, he certainly wouldn't come back as like a starter. But like if it was a deep playoff run and he was healthy enough to be able to play, you bet your ass they're going to bring him back and let him get like 15, 20 minutes a night off the bench in some capacity, maybe even close some games. Again, we're months away from that even being a remote possibility, but no Fred VanVleet, right? So we're operating with no Fred VanVleet. This team without Fred VanVleet certainly struggled, right? They had those 19 games. They went 11-8 in those 19 games. Now Ime Udoka actually at training camp day one for the Rockets hit us with like the most podcastery of stats. Like Ime Udoka could absolutely be a podcaster with the way that he pulled this stat out of his hat. In those 19 games, the Rockets were leading in 17 of them in the fourth quarter. They just struggled to close things out. Like they were such a bad team at the end of games offensively. The defense was great. The defense kept them in games. The defense flat out won them a ton of games last season, but their offense was just so abysmal, and it just dried up at the worst possible times for them routinely throughout the season. because the guy that they needed to really be able to rely on in those moments, namely Jalen Green, oftentimes couldn't really deliver in crunch time when he needed to, unfortunately. And so you add one of the greatest crunch time scorers ever, one of the most unguardable players ever in Kevin Durant. And that in and of itself, like, absolves the Rockets of those issues. Not 100%. There will still be moments. Obviously, KD is not like a complete, he is a cheat code to a degree, but the fact that KD gives them that bona fide 1A scorer, he gives them that legitimate closer that they so desperately missed last season in all those games, right? And again, those were just the games that Fred was missing, right? That's not even factoring in games that they lost when Fred was healthy, where they were, they just couldn't get a bucket, down the end of or down the stretch of a game. So without Fred, things certainly got a little bit messier. The ball security wasn't quite there. The Rockets with Fred VanVleet on the floor have been a great team at taking care of the basketball, limiting turnovers, really maximizing the kind of the possession battle at the end of the day. And the way that I kind of see this thing playing out this season, it kind of feels like the Rockets have a significantly lower floor without Fred VanVleet out there as the kind of steward of the offense and that guiding hand and really the emotional leader, the extension of the coaching staff out there on the floor. But they also feel like they have a higher ceiling because now by necessity, right, Thompson takes on an even bigger role than he was anticipated to have this season. Reed Sheppard is going to be just drop straight in the deep end, like sink or swim, buddy. Like you didn't really have it your rookie year. You better have it now as a sophomore or it's going to look really, really bad. And if I'm not worried about Thompson. He's not the if here. But if Reed Sheppard can hit the way that they really thought he would when they drafted him number 3 overall, if he can step up to the plate and really deliver on what they think he's capable of delivering, the ceiling for this Rockets team feels a little bit higher than it probably was with Fred VanVleet, just because you know what you're going to get out of Fred. He's a stabilizing force. He's the veteran. His ceiling is capped at this point. But we don't know what Thompson's ceiling is. We don't know what Reed Sheppard's ceiling is. And that's what makes this team a little bit more exciting with this dynamic play now, I think.
Yeah, well, so you said you know what to expect of Ime Thompson, and I agree in the role that he was in last year, for sure. And we did see him do a little bit more off the dribble stuff, like he had that game winner off the dribble. Again, that was more from like a fake DHO, take a couple of dribbles circumstance. But, like it's going to be a big thing. And I guess we can talk about what the early thought is on exactly how they're going to replace Fred and what the rotation is going to be. But my assumption is they're going to at least give Ime some reps at point guard. He's certainly capable of bringing the ball up, and he is a pretty good passer. The question is whether he can do anything off the dribble from the outside. And still, you are going to try to give Kevin Durant the ball, and Ime Thompson needs to stand somewhere where he's going to get guarded. If that's above the arc, even if he can bring the ball up, no problem, right? But then it's kind of like what you dealt with Ben Simmons in Philly. Ime's a much more dynamic finisher than Ben Simmons, but really he has to be along the baseline. He's been working on his corner 3. Maybe he can be out in the corner potentially, but once he gives the ball up, whether it's passing it to KD, coming off a wide pin down or a KD ISO, if he stays up top, his guy's going to be just at the nail. He's going to be in KD's lap, and it's going to be kind of difficult. So that there's the aspect of what happens when he gives it up, and then there's also the question of, well, how much actual creation is he going to be entrusted with? Is he going to run pick and roll with Sengun, which I think could be pretty fascinating, right? I mean, even if you're going to go under, well, Ime's so fast that he can still beat you to the under and get on top of the basket, or he's been working on that floater. Sengun's got a pretty good floater too. You want to switch it, well, then Sengun can post up. That might be something they do, is switch it and then try to double Sengun in the post after Ime throws in the ball. But there's so much different about having a primary ball handler who can't shoot. For when it was Russell Westbrook doing that, like, yeah, he was going to have the ball every time. It didn't matter as much that he couldn't shoot. But then once he didn't have the ball every time, then it became a little bit more of an issue. So those are the things that I'm thinking of here. I guess the first question I'll ask you is, for some of the early camp returns, is there any indication of who's going to start, what the rotation might be in the absence of Fred?
It's so wide open right now, Nate. It's crazy. Like, cause they could go multiple different ways. there was like a small possibility that they might have started Dorian Finney-Smith with them going out and poaching him from the Lakers this past offseason, and but he's not going to be ready at the start of the season. He's still recovering from his offseason ankle surgery, so he's not going to be good to go. He's not even doing like on court activities. He's just doing like shooting, like not participating in any of the drills currently, just doing like shooting workout and stuff like that. So he won't be there for the start of the season. Obviously, no Fred. The concern about the spacing is tough, right? With Amin, with a non-shooting primary ball handler. And at least right now, from what they spoke about at media day and the expectations surrounding this team is that they're going to, kind of do the whole playmaking thing by committee, right? So they'll lean into Alperen Sengun's playmaking ability more. They'll utilize Amin Thompson more. They'll utilize KD as a primary facilitator, right? And they're going to have to do it by committee because there's not any one player on the roster except for maybe Reed Sheppard if he actually hits the way that he needs to. There's not really any one player on the roster who can truly replicate what Fred VanVleet brought to this team, unfortunately. And so that's a really tough spot to be in if you're the Rockets. But to your point about the spacing concerns and how do you actually really deploy Amin Thompson if he is your primary ball handler, that's the beauty of this Rockets team is they can run so many different lineups. And I do fully believe that this year, even if it's not like the starting lineup right out of the gate, we're going to see stretches where this team elects to play their own version of, we'll call it small ball with one of Jabari Smith Jr. or Kevin Durant at the 5 and basically 5 out spacing around Amin Thompson, right? Because the blueprint is there. We've seen it with Russ. We've seen it with Giannis, right? You get a guy, you put the ball in the guy who's this insane one-man fast break downhill terror, right? And you let him attack downhill with 5 out spacing around him. And that's the blueprint. It's so simple, but it works. And Amin Thompson is at least capable of that. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that in too many significant stretches through his 2 years so far, namely just because the Rockets really didn't have the personnel to really highlight and play that way effectively. But now with guys like KD, with guys like Dorian Finney-Smith, with Jabari Smith Jr., getting back to the shooting numbers that he had, post hand injury last season, the Rockets do have the shooters that they can put around Amin Thompson. Reed Sheppard, another one, right? Guys who can space the floor around him and allow him that open driving lane to be able to get to the rim, put that downhill pressure on a defense, and then be able to create for his teammates or just score at the rim at will, or at the very least get to the free throw line. So as for the starting lineup right now, I mean, I think you're kind of between two different names. You either just go the conventional route and you start Reed Sheppard, you throw him in the deep end, he replaces Fred. Or you go a bit more unconventional, and this is something that we're definitely going to see this lineup. It might not be the starting lineup, but we're going to see this lineup at times, and it's going to be the Rockets like Monstars lineup, basically, with Amin Thompson at point, KD at the 2, Jabari at the 3, Sengun at the 4, and Steven Adams at the 5. And that is an absurd lineup to put out there, just from a size and length perspective, but also it's also kind of like a mess offensively because what do you even do with the spacing on that lineup? Because Adams doesn't shoot. Sengun isn't a reliable shooter yet. He's, working on the 3 ball and he's trying to take those shots with more confidence now. But, if he's out there, nobody's going to guard him from the 3-point line and nobody's guarding Amin Thompson from the 3-point line. So you basically have 2 shooters out of 5 players on the floor together. But it might not matter if the team's just that big and that strong and they can.
The numbers, they got 50% offensive rebounds basically with Sengun and Adams out there last year. And I hadn't really been thinking as much about the idea of Jabari at center. But yeah, I mean, between KD, Jabari, and Amen, like that, or even if you went with Tari Eason or Finney-Smith and put KD on the bench for that period, that would certainly be very viable. I'm with 3 centers, basically. I mean, maybe on nights where Adams isn't going to play, then it becomes more viable to do that. I think that's certainly something they should experiment with. I've been a little bit disappointed in the amount of experimentation that Ime Udoka has done. I think the way that they came out with that double big lineup was they were getting massacred by the Mavericks, and the greatest game that the Dallas Mavericks have ever played before Anthony Davis got hurt last year. And then he kind of went with it after that. I don't know that was something that he really wanted to do, and it turned out really to be something that I won't say it saved their season, but was certainly something that they really relied on down the stretch. But That's an interesting thought. So as I look through it here,
Well, really, really
to
quick.
me,
Anecdotally, I like before last year even started at last year's training camp, I actually asked Ime about the possibility because we knew that Steven Adams was going to have like a significant role on this Rockets team. That's why they went out and traded for him, and trying to figure out a way like, okay, well, how do you get Adams more than just like the 12 to 15 minutes that like a traditional backup would get? Well, the only way you do that without squashing Şengün's minutes is you have to find a way to play them together. And I remember asking him, I was like, can you play these guys together? And he talked a whole lot about, well, traditionally you'd want one of them to be a spacing big, and like Şengün is capable of doing that. It's all about the confidence in his shot, but we've looked at it a little bit. We might go to it some. And like he gave me like a very non-committal answer in training camp, and then we just didn't see it for like the first 4 or 5 months of the season, and then suddenly, bam, out of nowhere, it just against the Mavericks, it shows up, and it becomes like this insane go-to haymaker that teams really didn't have an answer for. And I know just here's a fun stat for you, Nate. And I don't know if you've seen this one floating around or not, but it is an important stat here when you consider what the Rockets may try and do a lot more of this season. The best three-man lineup in the NBA last year through the regular season and the playoffs was the three-man lineup featuring Jabari Smith Jr., Alperen Sengun, and Steven Adams. More than 250 possessions minimum 250 possessions played. They had a plus 37.9 net rating with that trio on the floor across those possessions, 86.8 defensive rating, 124.7 offensive rating. Like when those three were out there, good things happened. And now you are talking about potentially just, you can have that trio out there and then just slide in 7-foot tall KD at the 2-guard spot to be your hyper efficient, high volume scorer. And then defensively, like things get a little murky where like how much man defense can you really play with like KD and Jabari at the 2-3 spot? Like you really have to lean heavily into the zone defense.
They played exclusively that 2-3.
Yeah, exactly.
That Golden State finally solved in Game 7. But that that kind of matchup 2-3 that they ran, it really caused problems for the Warriors. And they won't have to run it as a matchup unless you're going up against a Curry level of shooter. So yeah, I mean they had a lot of effectiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, just I just wanted to include that stat just because I think it's very telling, and the Rockets are going to certainly lean into. That's why they went and got Clint Capella, right? They're going to run a ton of double big lineups, not just with Şengün and Adams, but also with some Şengün and Capella. And it's lower on my I don't think we'll ever see Capella Adams out there together. But like if that happens, then maybe I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I talked about how Steven Adams in that playoff series was essentially he provided black hole spacing where he would just suck in everybody because he would either try to post up at the charge circle or he would just stand under the basket and everyone had to just really respect him. And so like he wasn't going to go get an alley-oop, but you still couldn't leave him. And so that was opening up a lot of driving lanes for people. So I like to think of it maybe just in terms of some of the combinations, right? So to me, I think you make a very good point about Amen. I don't know how good the fit between he, KD, and a center is going to be. I think so. I kind of like the idea of Sheppard and KD and Şengün all playing together, and maybe you can throw Jabari in there and have kind of more of a conventionally spaced floor. Now, KD, as much as anyone, is capable of getting to a mid-range spot and just rising up and dealing with a lack of spacing. He doesn't really get to the basket anymore, but he still is just an unbelievable mid-range shooter. The Rockets took a ton of long twos last year and just couldn't make any. They only shot 40%. So I think you could see the idea of what it'd be like to plug in KD for Jalen Green in that late clock shot creating role. And then, Amen, I do like him. I think putting him in with spacing is something I hadn't thought about as much if you went Jabari at center. I also think he's a pretty good fit with Steven Adams. Steven Adams really thrived with Russell Westbrook when they played together, just because Adams is such a road grading screener that, yeah, your game plan might be to go under. Steven Adams is just going to bone crush you anyway, and you're not going to be able to go under, and then that's going to release Amen going to the basket. And then if he misses, Adams will just clean up the offensive rebound. So he has a lot of experience. John Morant's another point guard who wasn't really a great shooter, but Adams' screening really opened things up for him. So I like that combination some as well. You want to try to get Şengün and Adams out there for 10 or 15 minutes a game, particularly against backup units, because a lot of teams will like to start a big center and then that guy will be off the floor right when you're coming in with Şengün and Adams. That could be pretty powerful as well. So I like
And
those are some of the combinations that I'm thinking of. So yeah, what's your reaction on that?
well, just thinking about too, like the Adams thing was so unique because that was one thing that he came in and because he didn't play, the Rockets got him at the trade deadline, a season and a half ago or whatever, 2 years ago it was, and he didn't actually participate that season, the first year under Ime Udoka. So last year was his first year. And watching him like at training camp and in practices with the guys and really communicating with all the different guards on the team, Amen included, right, about how to really manipulate certain screening angles and really working the kind of some of the same screen setting stuff that he did with Russ and with Ja as well. And those Steven Adams like high screen and rolls where he comes out like well beyond the 3-point line and just absolutely crushes the on-ball defender and gives you that wide open driving lane. Like you start thinking about even lineups that are going to feature Amen, Sengun, Adams, right? 3 non-shooters. If you've got Adams and Amen all the way out beyond the 3-point line with that screen being set, and then you've got Sengun playing out of the dunker, like you've still got ideal spacing as long as the other 2 guys are, flared out to the wings. Like you're in a good spot to be able to attack that way. So on paper, like at first glance, you're like, oh my God, this lineup is horrible. It's got terrible spacing. And, there's still going to be times where it's a little clunky, but I think there are certain sets and actions that you can run. And to your point about mentioning, right, the kind of the black hole gravity that Adams does have, that's one of the benefits of playing Adams at the 5 and Sengun at the 4 is he makes life easier for Sengun because he literally stops the other big from being able to go and be that secondary help defender or, that other big from getting out of position, trying to box out for the defensive rebound, because the moment that defender leaves his spot, hell, even if the defender doesn't leave his spot, Steven Adams is probably still going to soak up a good number of offensive rebounds because he's just that damn strong. But, all these guys have a level of gravity themselves. Like, Sengun's got an incredible amount of gravity as, a post player, as a face-up guy, commanded the second most number of double teams in the NBA last season behind only Nikola Jokic. And, now the Rockets have more weapons and a pretty good weapon in KD to be able to capitalize on some of those double teams. So now it's kind of like pick your poison, right? Like, do you double KD? Do you double Sengun, right? Those 2 guys are going to make life so much easier for one another. It's just, even though the fit can be a little questionable at times on paper, I think when you start to look under the hood, there's a lot to like there about some of these lineups and some of the different ways that they can be deployed.
Yeah, I've been very excited about Sengun screening for KD off the ball. I think on ball they could work reasonably well too. It's going to have to happen, but to me, I would like to minimize KD's burden as a pick and roll ball handler up top. But to the extent those guys are interacting, if you try to switch that, hopefully KD can be a good enough pocket passer to hit Sengun on the move, and Sengun is really good at that face up, take a couple dribbles, go into that spin move, or just bludgeon the guy when he catches it moving towards the basket.
Dude, it's gonna be inverted pick and rolls, Nate. It's gonna be beautiful. Yeah. You're gonna have KD setting screens for Sengun, and then what do you do there? Like that's such a dilemma for the defense at that point.
Yeah, and so you probably can't switch that, and then or Sengun could just duck in if you do try to switch it as well. And then of course you got to really respect KD because he'll just drain that mid ranger. You can't afford to give that shot up as well. So that combination should be pretty effective unless the guy throwing them the pass is someone that you can just immediately leave and double team and have a nail help and try to deal with it that way. So that's, if it was Fred VanVleet throwing that pass, that's not someone that you're going to leave open. If it's a men, then you worry about it a little bit. And if it's Reed Sheppard, like he's struggled to deal with the Detroit Pistons Summer League pressure. Like, is he going to be able to get them into the offense? That's probably my biggest question about him. And then, just the overall, like they don't really have a normal 2 guard on this team who can make shots like a 2 guard either. I mean, they're going to be like KD can do it, but then your front court shooting is not going to be great. And I think also like not having Finney Smith at the beginning of the year is going to hurt them some too in terms of the spacing. So it's going to be, I think Udoka is going to be very judicious in how he mixes all these guys together in making sure that his main guys have space to operate.
No, certainly. And I mean, here's like, I don't know, when you start to get into, they're certainly going to be a little hampered here at the beginning of the season with no DFS. That's kind of a big blow, because they're already, it's not that they don't have depth. it's that some of what they were relying on, right? Fred being that floor
Yeah.
spacer, DFS being the additional floor spacer, and also kind of the defensive successor to Dylan Brooks, right? And missing out on some of these guys is certainly going to hurt them. But I also just think you look at, their big three, so to speak, right? Between KD, Sengun, and Amen, they're going to have just enough talent, and they'll still have the defensive fortitude to be able to come out of the gate strong. I feel like it might not look as pretty as it will maybe later in the season when they start getting some of these guys back, and when they're a little bit more, fleshed out, and the chemistry's there, and guys are, used to playing with and off of one another. So it'll look clunky at times for sure right out of the gate, but I think there's enough there for them to work with that they're not going to like struggle or anything from the jump, I don't think.
What did you make of Sengun's season a year ago? You mentioned that he took a step back from an efficiency standpoint. Then we saw him absolutely destroy Eurobasket. What do you expect from him on the offensive end this year?
Yeah, I think that, there's enough evidence in his body of work so far, right? That, in years 2 and 3 of his career, he was really good. He was efficient around the rim. He was, maybe not like crazy hyper efficient, but he was at least on par for where you'd want a big, playing at his volume, shot volume, everything to be at. And then he had that super, down year last season where, first off, he spent, between years 3 and 4, he spent years 3 and 4, rehabilitating his body after that really rough leg injury that ended his third season a little short against the Kings. And so he came back in easily the best shape of his career. Like, he looked like a different player when he came back, and he talked about spending so much time really working on his body that offseason to get ready for the next year with a lot of the demands, especially the defensive demands that were being placed on him by the coaching staff. And I think that,
and he took great strides, I thought, defensively.
Absolutely. Like he is now, I feel confident in saying that he is like legitimately a plus level defender, and is a very impactful defensive piece for this Rockets team. He's the anchor for what was a top 5 defense last season. But as a result of that, I think that he lost a little bit of the focus, a little bit of the attention to detail on some of the offensive stuff. And he's talked about that a lot in both, English interviews and some Turkish interviews this past offseason about recommitting his focus. And this was also kind of a mandate from the Rockets coaching staff themselves, recommitting his focus to the offensive side of the ball, and really having to be a little bit better about, kind of not necessarily picking and choosing, like, am I focusing on offense this game? Am I focusing on defense? But just balancing the two kind of sides of the basketball. And we see, we know some of the, greatest offensive players that this game has ever seen, right? Guys that are, guys like Luka and Harden and LeBron, guys who have such a heavy offensive burden that they are known to take plays off defensively, right? Well, the inverse can also be true, right? If you are really exerting yourself defensively and expelling so much energy on that side of the floor, you might not have enough at times for your offense. And I think that's where Sengun maybe struggled a little bit, is the identity of the team and his responsibility on last year's team. Like, the only reason the Rockets zone defense worked the way that it did with the double big lineups and with Adams and Sengun is because it was a really bizarre zone. It wasn't just like your prototypical 2-3 zone, whatever. Like, it wasn't that. It was like and Adams even tried to describe it at one point during one of the playoff post games, where he was like, it's a bizarro zone because, like, you have guys that are like running around and nobody's like really sticking to like their quadrant of the zone. Like, it's just weird. And it only works because Sengun got to a place with, his mobility and his just ability to like chase guys around the perimeter, guys that are much smaller than him, right? That it wouldn't work if Sengun didn't really level up his conditioning, his speed, his agility, everything, to be able to kind of be able to do some of that stuff. And so I think that the expectation for him this year, right, is to get back to some of that finishing that he showed in years 2 and 3, while still being the guy that commanded all these double teams, while still being the guy, the playmaker that we know that he can be. I think that Eurobasket is a lot more of like what I'm expecting to see out of Sengun this season. And it certainly feels like now, especially in the absence of Fred VanVleet, that Ime Udoka, kind of by necessity, is going to have to lean more into that version of Alperen Sengun as a primary initiator and not just a play finisher, which is kind of what it felt like he became a lot last season, was a play finisher instead. And he kind of struggled in that role because he wasn't as efficient around the basket, unfortunately.
Yeah, that was the thing that stuck out to me. he was taking shots where, especially I would say within maybe 5 feet or so, where he was getting them off and he just would kind of get bothered a little bit. And like, it was a shot that you expected him to make, and
Yep.
it just did not go in the basket. If you look at his shooting year over year, he was 49.6% from 3 to 10 feet 2 years ago, 45.4%. And then he didn't take too many of outside of 10 feet, but he was over 50% on those. And then he took a lot more of those and was under 40% in the 10 to 16 foot range a year ago. And so he didn't get quite as much at the rim. He at least reduced some of his 3-point shooting, which, as you noted, I don't think that's really going to be something that's a huge part of his game anytime soon. The other thing that was kind of interesting is that, and now part of this is because he probably had more offensive rebounds, but his percentage of 2-pointers assisted went from 63% down to 47% as well. So he was someone who had to work a lot harder for his points, and hopefully that'll be less the case this year. But I think he can have a bounce back year. That's something that Danny talked about too, where he just, like, we've seen him make more shots than this. And I think that if he just gets back to his level of efficiency that he was a couple of years ago, then he would actually be, an all-star level player. I thought he kind of got the all-star nod last year just because the Rockets were good and they had 9 really good players and somebody had to get the credit in the coach's eyes. So I'm expecting more from him. I'm expecting him to emerge as someone that we're talking about as like a legitimate offensive hub. And to me, that improvement, as much as the addition of KD, is what I would be leaning on as my hope for this Rockets offense taking the next step in the half court.
Yeah, I mean, well, you look at, the strides that he took defensively, and if you just sprinkle in, the finishing getting back to what it was, a couple years ago, as well as, a slightly bigger role for him offensively as an initiator, I think there's a world where Sengun could very easily, hit like 22, 23 points per game, 10 or 11 rebounds per contest, and then that 6 or 7 assists per game kind of number. And you pair all that, if he's able to still keep the defense at a plus level the way that he was last season, that's an all NBA player right there. He was 1 vote shy of being an all NBA player just this past season, right? Despite some of the offensive regression that we saw out of him. And I think that's kind of like the version of him that we saw in Eurobasket, where he literally was doing all these things. Like, he was making game-winning, game-sealing plays on defense for that Turkish team. He was everything that he was their offensive hub. He was running the show for them, creating offense. I think that is the version of Sengun that Ime Udoka and the Rockets are certainly going to have to lean into. And, depending on what the rest of the race looks like, that could be a guy that might be in the running. I'm not going to say like top 3 or whatever for MVP, but that's going to be a guy that gets like kind of the Donovan Mitchell-esque like MVP consideration, the way that D Mitch was like the 5th or 6th name in like MVP voting last season. It'll be like that for Sengun if he's putting up those kinds of numbers.
Yeah. Well, that should have been Evan Mobley, but that's this is not the Cavaliers outlook. So who's going to start for these guys? Who should start for these guys?
I think you just got to go with the traditional kind of answer here and just go, it's going to be Reed, Amen, Jabari, KD, and Sengun. Although I think, Nate, I'm being very genuine here. I think there's a very realistic possibility that it could be a fluid situation with the starting lineup, because I don't think there's, if Fred was healthy, right, Reed wouldn't be starting. And that much is a given. And then if Fred was starting, then there might even be a legitimate conversation as to whether Jabari is truly the best fit as the 5th starter when you're starting, the rest of the guys in that lineup, because I think it does leave a little bit of something to maybe be desired from like your point of attack defense, a little bit, because if you've got Amen taking the toughest defensive assignment, and then, outside of that, now there is no Fred VanVleet, right? So you can't even count on him. Now you're counting on potentially Reed Sheppard. So you've got Amen taking the toughest perimeter defensive assignment.
And that was Dylan Brooks's job last year, and he's not there anymore.
Yeah. So then where do you go after that, right? Like the example that I like to use a lot here is, what do you do when you match up with OKC, right? Because you're throwing Amen on SGA. who becomes in charge of guarding J-Dub, right? Like, do you feel really good about putting Jabari on J-Dub full time? No, not at all. Like, Jabari can handle switches, and he's a very versatile defender, but you don't want him guarding J-Dub for a full 48-minute basketball game.
He's like too big to get over a screen.
Yeah.
And so is KD, I would say.
Exactly. And so, because they're kind of cut from the same cloth a little bit there. Jabari's more of a big, and KD's more of a skinny big, but still the point stands. You don't want either of those guys chasing around a wing for the majority of a game. You just don't. Especially given Jabari took some serious strides as like a help side defender and kind of a weak side, shot blocker and rim deterrent. And that kind of puts him out of position to do things like that, which is what made him really, really beneficial to the Rockets defense last season. So I think you start to get into that territory of like, okay, well, then like there's legitimate arguments for maybe Tari Eason to enter the starting lineup, or this would be the place where you start to heavily consider Dorian Finney-Smith in that starting lineup, because then he does give you that additional point of attack defender to throw out there and try and slow down a J-Dub, or, if you're looking at a team like the Lakers with LeBron and Luka, like what are you doing when you're trying to stop multiple premier perimeter guys at the same time? And from that perspective, I think that the Rockets are kind of, in a weird way, kind of stuck, because like they're not going to have DFS right away. And that's where I just come away thinking like the double big is probably the thing that they just lean on, because then they don't have to worry about it, right? They lean into the defense, they lean into the zone, and that'll be the way they kind of
they can play zone without the double big too, right? I mean, if you think
they can.
Like KD, Jabari, and Sengun on the back line of a zone. I mean, zone usually works the best when you have a lot of size. Or the other thing too is they're still going to switch everything 1 through 4, and they'll try to keep Sengun along the baseline as much as they can by pre-switching some of these actions. Or maybe even you say, well, hey, we got Kevin Durant and we got Jabari Smith out here. Yeah, fine. If it's late in the clock, they've succeeded in getting a second guy into a double drag, and now we got to get Sengun switching out on the floor. Like we'll deal with that, even because we have enough help beyond the play. We can shrink the floor. We can force teams to play late in the shot clock. We'll be able to get a defensive rebound with KD and Jabari, even if Sengun is out on the floor. So maybe that's something that they might look at as well. I do think it's a fascinating decision early. I would say Finney-Smith would be the guy I would want to start probably.
Yeah.
Because I'm just not sure Reed Sheppard is right. Like if Reed Sheppard comes out in camp, and like from what I've seen from him so far, he's not ready to be the starting point guard on a team like this.
I will say, Nate, the buzz around the team, both like publicly, through media day and camp and everything, but also like just from a little bit of what I'm hearing kind of behind the scenes, is Reed is really impressed. And like he is.
Yeah. Well, like, if he could start, that would be great. That would be the best for because they need that positional shooting. They just don't have that.
But it's even less so. Like I think the shooting, right? Because the shooting is going to be nice, and the shooting's the one thing that I'm like not concerned about with Reed. It's like he's going to be able to shoot the ball. It's how does he, like you said earlier and alluded to, right? How does he handle defensive pressure when he's actually trying to initiate?
But
sets?
If they've got a men could bring the ball up too, right? If he's playing with a men on
for sure. But then at that point, if you're just going to relegate Reed Sheppard to like a spot up three point shooter role, then like you might even just be better off served like playing Aaron Holiday. Like you need more from Reed Sheppard than just like standing at the 3-point line and shooting the ball. My biggest concern for Reed is going to be, what does he look like defensively? Because in his rookie year and at various points, like he's a crafty defender and he's got quick hands and he does like, make some great recoveries at times defensively, but he also like last year, he just got blown by so easily way too often. He got
fouls
bullied
a lot too. I mean, he's got to, if he's going to start for this team, he's going to have to be way more judicious with his hands. I mean, that's an appeal that he gets all these blocks and steals, but you can't average 6 fouls per 36 or whatever he averaged.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing where he was talking about it, at media day, is that like he starting a month ago when he like was back in town and started like working out and everything, he basically was only like doing defense only drills like for the first like 3 weeks, where he would just come in and not even touch a basketball, where he was just coming in and only playing defense, only working on his defense, and that was it. And he was like, it wasn't very fun, but it was important. And so if he takes a step forward defensively and is able to get to a place where he's just not like the Rockets' Achilles heel when he's out there on the defensive end, even if he's got like this ginormous backline that he can rely on, like that puts so much pressure on the backline defenders, right? That puts a lot of pressure on the other 4 guys to be able to make up for any shortcomings that he has. And the reason that the Rockets were so good and have been so good through 2 years under Ime Udoka is all 5 guys have been like so connected and They've been great communicators, and there really hasn't at times been, I guess, a weak link in the Rockets defense. Like even Jalen Green took strides as a defender and was able to like stop guys in isolation and switch on to even bigger defenders at times and really like making his presence felt on that side of the floor. And so the only reason the Rockets defense looked that good is because all 5 guys were plus defenders. And if suddenly one guy is like the weak link in the chain, that exposes the entire defensive structure.
Yeah, you might be a little higher on Sengun than I am. I mean, I agree with you that he was a solid rim protector. I think he can struggle out in space a little bit, but yeah, I mean, I think certainly within Udoka's system, he was effective, and yeah, you could because Durant too is just he's not going to be engaged that much defensively, particularly now that he's going to have to play this much bigger offensive role throughout the season. He wasn't engaged for a full season when I was watching him every night in Golden State 7 or 8 years ago. Like he's not gonna do that now at 37. Even though I think he's had some very nice defensive moments, even on kind of lost cause teams in Brooklyn and Phoenix. Yeah, I mean, so that would be great. Like if Sheppard can defend well enough, and I mean, yeah, I mean, I hope that he's going to be that level of shooter. We'll see. Like if he's someone that you can really run plays for off the ball to get shots, like that's something that they desperately need. I mean, to me, even more than missing Fred as a ball handler and pick and roll operator, I think they're going to miss him as a shooter, just as someone that you could really count on to make shots from that position.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be fascinating. I mean, if Sheppard can't seize that spot and Udoka decides to go Tari Eason, I mean, that has its own, I mean, they're going to be impossible to score on, to get the Terror Twins together and get the size of Durant and Smith out there too. But then, you're really going to be spacing challenged at that point. You've got 2 guys. Like I think Jabari can shoot it better than he did last year overall, but just KD and Jabari is as your only shooters is probably not enough. If you can replace Eason with Sheppard, then I do think you probably have enough shooting that starting lineup. You still would have to stagger Sheppard and Amen to some degree, just so you have enough ball handling, or maybe they just bring Holiday into the mix as well and bring Sheppard along a little bit more slowly, or even play Holiday and Sheppard together on the second unit to take some of the pressure off of him.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, right now, for opening night at least, and hopefully we see, my hope is that we see Udoka kind of play around with this throughout training camp and see all these different lineups that we've been discussing here, and what works, what doesn't work. My money though would be on opening night because OKC is going to run their double big with Chet and Hartenstein. My money would be that Steven Adams actually starts on opening night against that double big lineup.
Interesting. Okay, that would be fascinating. Yeah, I do think Adams works better on the second unit, but yeah, like how much he's able to play this year will be noteworthy as well. Although I assume Capella can step in for him. And then your closing group, would that change at all from what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple in there that are there's 3 in there that are guaranteed, right? And the 3 that are guarantees are going to be KD, Sengun, Amen in some capacity, right? Those 3 guys are going to be out there to close. I think at that point, then you start to look at, I think at that point it becomes matchup dependent, right? Is the other team running their big lineup? Are they running double bigs? Are they running size? Do you want Adams out there? If you're going for that, that jumbo lineup with the defensive zone that's worked so well for this team, or do you want a little bit more switchability, right? Do you want some of your better point of attack defenders out there, right? That's where you start getting into the idea of, a lineup that could be featuring DFS and Tari Eason, right? And then suddenly you've got the Terror Twins plus a DFS out there. That's 1, 2, 3 great point of attack guys to, try and lock down whatever you're trying to get, whatever you're trying to do to close out a game. And at the end of a game anyways, right, is, that's going to be when it's KD's time to shine. So I think the spacing becomes a little bit less of a worry maybe at the end, because KD is a guy that, like you already alluded to earlier, it doesn't matter if you send a double team, he'll just elevate over the top and get to those ridiculous contested mid-range, jumpers and knock them down with relative ease. But I think again, the closing lineup has chances to be different as well. Those 3 are going to be the staples of the closing lineup, but it really does feel like, you're going to be able to see different guys at various points throughout the season closing alongside that trio, and it's going to be very matchup dependent at the end of the day.
What do you see? We've talked about a lot of them already, but any that we haven't hit on in terms of strengths and weaknesses for this group?
Are you talking about lineups or specific players? Apologies.
No, just like the overall group. Are they going to be? We talked about them being really good on the offensive glass and the floor game. Like, what are they going to really like? What are the strengths Udoka can rely? Like, all right, we're going to beat them in this area, and what's he gonna have to try to kind of paper over?
So I think that one kind of maybe like underrated thing about this team that it's underrated. Sorry, I guess let me rephrase. One weakness for this team that I think maybe not enough people are noticing or talking about enough is they have gotten considerably older. Like all of a sudden, they do still have a bunch of young guys on the team, but they also don't really have many like true downhill threats. Is the problem? Like it's you look on the roster, it's basically just Amin Thompson. That's it. Like he's their one guy that can put the ball on the floor and get downhill. And even then, he's not a shooting threat. So like there's still like the luxury for defenses to potentially sag off and kind of take away some of those driving lanes. But this team, caused so much mayhem defensively last year and then got out in transition and scored some easy fast break opportunities, things of that nature. Who's going to run with a men? He's a one-man fast break, so he'll have plenty of opportunities just to do his own thing in transition. But who are the other athletes on this team that are going to be running with him in transition during those opportunities? Last year it was, Jalen Green or Cam Whitmore or even Dylan Brooks to a lesser degree, right? Could run and at least, flare out to the 3-point line in transition and be a catch and shoot threat in transition, things like that. I think that this team is going to slow down considerably and they're going to play a lot in the half court for better or for worse, unfortunately. And that's going to be interesting to see just kind of how that dynamic plays out. And, if that really bites them, because they do need to be able to capitalize on those, turnovers and those points in transition. And so who's really going to be able to step up and do some of that, right? I think that Tari Eason will. Tari Eason's probably Amin's best running mate in transition at this point.
Yeah.
And then I'm really, my eyes are on Reed Sheppard too. And what does that pairing look like when Amin and Reed are sharing the floor together? Because Reed should be able to either, reliably run the break in transition when the Rockets do force a turnover or get a miss and a quick outlet or something. And if he's got, Amin and Tari flanking him on the wings, then he's got weapons there. But that's kind of something that I'm paying attention to that might turn out to be a pretty distinct weakness for this team.
Yeah. I think just overall creation, like they have a lot of interesting options, and Sheppard and Amen are guys who could get a lot better. But it's really Sengun and it's KD that they're going to be relying on. I mean, neither of those guys is, if we're talking about a team that's truly going to compete for a championship, I don't know if like KD is your best player is there at this point. And now they have so much talent around him. And so maybe that's how they can get there. And they're going to be awesome in the floor game. And there's certainly no team that's going to be able to just like shunt them aside because they have these advantages that make them really hard to play against. But I also think like in the playoffs in particular, KD can be loaded up against. I have a question for you. Is the offensive coaching a possible weakness?
Yeah. Oh, well, hey, yes. Let's, and this is something I've hit on a lot over the summer over at Locked on Rockets is like this season is going to shine a very bright spotlight on Ime Udoka and his offensive creativity, because on paper, he's got a lot of different ways that he can play. He's got a ton of different lineups that he can run. He's got so many versatile players. He's got different guys that he can run the offense through, be it Sengun, be it KD, be it Amin Thompson, right? Now, again, we talked about the different ways where you can do like the 5-out play with Amin Thompson and let him get downhill. You can play more traditional with Sengun and getting those post-up touches. You can play with KD either in isolation or some 2-man game between him and take your pick of whoever else on the roster. Like there's so many different ways that you can play with this roster. If the offense still looks blasé, vanilla, uninspired at times, which it has through the first 2 years, then that's going to be a bit of an indictment on the coaching staff and in particular Ime, right? Like he has the weapons now to do some creative, fun stuff offensively. And there really isn't an excuse for him not to at this point, especially because now with the absence of Fred VanVleet is where you would need to get a bit more unconventional, where you do need to start thinking outside the box of different ways to try and be able to accomplish what you want to accomplish on the offensive side of the floor. And so that's been my one thing about Ime is like, I've kind of joked before, he's like the inverse of Mike D'Antoni, where like MDA did not care about defense or at all. And like so much so that 17-18 Rockets team, like the defense did. MDA didn't coach defense on that team, right? That was Jeff Bzdelik, right? His lead assistant. He was in charge of the defense. I've joked before and like not really joked, but like with some level of sincerity, Ime Udoka might benefit from bringing in a lead assistant to just run the offense, like a guy who can be a bit more creative and, you know, really make the offense his own little thing. I don't know if Ime's pride would ever let him do that. But like, that's just kind of where I've been at least through 2 years of watching these Rockets offenses these past couple seasons. Now, some of that maybe is, you know, was he hamstrung by having to play as much through Jalen Green as he did and really, you know, prioritizing touches for him for, you know, a hyper inefficient 2 guard that needed touches to try and get going, things like that. I don't know. We'll see. But there's no reason why the offense shouldn't look better given the pieces that he has on paper this season, the additional shooting, the weapons, all of that stuff.
Yeah, and that was even a problem going back to his year in Boston where they had some offensive struggles, particularly in the clutch. And the things that I'll be looking for is just, you got to just move faster from action to action. It's just too much station to station, too slow. And unfortunately, that's one of the
sometimes there's
Kevin
no
Durant,
movement is the concern. Like that's the other issue.
Yeah, and it just, oh, okay, we did this, it didn't work. All right, now we'll throw it to this guy. Someone else is going to jog up and set a screen, and it just, you're not flowing from action to action quickly. Unfortunately, Kevin Durant has not really been very good at playing that quick style because it's so easy for him to score. He's very happy to just kind of set up the pins, and more often than not, he's able to knock them down. The older he gets, the more difficult that becomes. However, a couple of stats for you here. Again, this, you noted they didn't have a ton of talent. I thought he could have done more maybe to try to unleash Amen Thompson, for example, in the half court. But the Houston Rockets took the most self-created shots in the league, according to our metrics, with more than 2 seconds of touch time. And when you consider that they certainly didn't have the best isolation creators in the league, that is a rather damning statistic. They had took 46.2 self-created field goal attempts per 100. So that is a pretty ugly number, and they were among the worst in the NBA at actually converting those. And similarly, they had, by our numbers, that take into account touch time, whether a shot is contested or not. It's player agnostic, but they had some of the worst shot quality in the league a year ago by our numbers. And again, the offensive rebounding can help that, but that latter number actually factors in the offensive rebounding. So the Rockets just generally got up more shots. That's part of the reason that self-created number is a little bit higher per 100 possessions. But you know, they took a lot of long twos. Again, not a team that had great long two shooters. So having KD is going to paper over a lot of these ills, I think. But you do have to wonder about whether the offensive system is going to be good enough, as good as Udoka has been in virtually every other area.
It's a Band-Aid fix for what could be a much deeper seated issue. But if the Band-Aid fix works for now, then like it works for now. And that's all they're really worried about is the for now, right? So that's kind of where I think that you looked at KD and you're like, yeah, well, it was, if you suddenly replace all those long twos that Jalen Green was taking with long twos from KD, then like suddenly, holy crap, the offense actually looks good. Like suddenly you're maybe like a top 7, top 8 offense if you just swap those 2 players.
So as we move into our predictions, I have these guys as the number 3 defense in the NBA. OKC is tier 1 by themselves. They've got Orlando and Houston in the second tier, and then a big group. There are a lot of good defenses out there. Clippers, Golden State, Cleveland, Dallas, Portland, San Antonio. Like there are a lot of good defenses out there. I'm not saying Houston's clearly going to be better than them, but and also when I did these, that was before I knew that Finney Smith was going to miss time, and also before I knew that Fred was going to be out. So if considering that, I might bump them down more into sort of that middle of the top 10 defensively. And my hope is they can get into the lower end of the top 10 offensively. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think you pretty much hit the nail on exactly kind of where I had them pegged. Like KD by himself should be worth like, a bump of like, 3 or 4 spots offensively. Like again, genuinely just swapping out his shot profile or Jalen Green's shot profile for KD's shot profile and efficiency. You're getting basically a walking 50, 40, 90 guy, 26 points a night on hyper good efficiency. Defense is fair, and I think it's also fair to maybe knock them a couple pegs because of, again, the loss of Fred, the absence of DFS at least to start the season. So top 3 might not be as attainable as it once was on paper, but they'll still be a damn good defense. They'll still be top 5. They'll still be super physical, and they'll be the team that you see on the calendar. You're like, oh, crap, we got to deal with these guys tonight. No team's going to want to deal with the size that the Rockets are able to put on the floor every single game. I think that's a sweet spot, is like that 3 to 5 range defensively, and then top 10 feels like it almost feels like a given, just because what did they finish last year? Offense like 12th, in offensive rating, and that was with the offense rebounding numbers really propping things up. Yeah, so like I feel like they can still mask over some of their potential inefficiencies with the size and the offensive rebounding, but then you're also adding in KD. And so like I think that's at least worth, again, a handful of spots. I have them around, probably 7 or 8. And if you're talking about a top 5 defense and 7th or 8th in offense, that's the recipe for success. We've talked about it, for years on a number of different platforms, right? When you're top 10 in offense, top 10 in defense, that's a legitimate title contender right there.
So as I look at some of the 4 factors, they're 8th in avoiding turnovers last year. I think that number is going to go up without Fred. I think the spacing might be even worse this year. Durant's never been amazing at avoiding turnovers, especially the more he has to dribble. Amen, he's going to be kind of banging his head against a brick wall. If they're going to throw more through Sengun, like he'll find guys on some great passes, but he'll also turn it over. They didn't get to the free throw line at all last year, which is kind of interesting for as physical as these guys play. I think they can get better in that area. KD is not the free throw draw that he used to be, but he still is better than Jalen Green. I don't know if they'll be above midline, but I think they should get better in that area. The offensive rebounding, I would still project them to be number 1. I think they're going to have 35% offensive rebounds again this year. I tend to think not, just because that was such an outlier number.
Their numbers are so crazy when you look at the offensive rebounding.
But they're also going to lean into that even more. I guess the question becomes, just the rest of the league is probably, I think, going to be better at dealing overall with the offensive rebounding approach. I think everybody is just emphasizing rebounding more, and everybody's emphasizing turnover forcing more too. So I think that could be a little bit difficult. Also noteworthy that the Rockets were only mid-pack in forcing turnovers a season ago. If they are going to play more zone, like Jabari, KD, these guys are more kind of positional defenders. You really, at this point, you've got Amen and you've got Tari Eason, and that's about it in terms of guys who are going to force turnovers. Like VanVleet is someone that they're going to miss there. And maybe Sheppard actually could contribute, but I don't know how great they're going to be there. I think they're going to be even better on the defensive glass, though, where they were 8th a year ago. I think they'll be better at not fouling as well, just due to generally having more size. So I kind of actually think they're going to be about where they were last year, because let's not forget that they were 4th in the NBA already last year, net rating plus 5.4. So I'm actually going to go with an identical record to last year. I'm going to pick them for 52 wins.
I like and for all those points, I will say the one that I'm most concerned about is the turnovers, because that's the one that has the most chance. It could get really ugly really quick with this Rockets team, unfortunately, and that's going to be, especially if Ime does try to do some creative things offensively, and if it starts to get turned sideways, and if the guys can't execute, and then maybe he tries to dial things back. I don't know. Just it's really up in the air, and this is where, like, seeing, for example, like Seth Curry sign with the Golden State Warriors, I should be able to go off rip and just start naming a bunch of, vet minimum, like free agent ball handling guards, shooting guards. That could have provided
they need to get one more shooter. That's what we haven't talked about too, is the possibility of a trade potentially. I think the better they play, the more likely they are to do that. They can't trade Fred. We'll see what happens with Eason's
They
extension.
can't
whether
trade
he would be
anybody, man. Like it's just the thing
Yeah.
is
Right
they
now
like
they can't. Yeah.
they
Right
can't.
now
Basically they're in a holding pattern until December 15th. Like they
which is
cannot
fine.
do
Which
anything.
is fine.
Yeah, so
I think that's totally fine to see how it
you got
works out. I mean, I said this with John when Fred went down, that I thought that is really just losing his shooting was kind of more important. I guess I said that today too. So having just one more option you could go to as a shooter would be nice. But like, what is that trade, right? Would they trade for, a Contavious Caldwell Pope type of guy? But then who's the matching salary for that? Like, they don't want to have to give up Adams, and they're pretty
well
close to the first April.
the
They
one
can't take in on anything.
the one that you start to look at as like if you're really getting into like trade bait territory is probably Clint Capella, because he's on that sign and trade deal.
Yeah.
And so you could use that $7 million contract, and he could get you a kind of a net you a decent return, and then maybe you pivot away. Or again, he's just a depth addition, right? Like he's not even like an integral part of the whole double big lineup thing. It's just he's there for the back-to-backs that Steven Adams doesn't play if the Rockets still want to play big, basically. And don't get it wrong, like they're very happy to have Clint back. They love him, here organizationally in Houston. He's excited to be back, so like it's good vibes all around. But if he can net you like another ball handler, another shooter, especially now with the absence of Fred VanVleet, that's going to be one thing that I think the Rockets take a very hard look at once December 15th ultimately rolls around and some of these guys start becoming tradable. But yeah, that's that Josh Okogie signing. Like I like Josh Okogie as a player, but like he was not what they needed for that final spot, unfortunately.
No, I like someone like Garrison Matthews would I think have been better, or Landry Shamet looks like was always going to be back in New York, but still like that sort of player maybe would have been a better fit. Now, of course, Josh Okogie he offensive rebounds and he gets steals and he gets out in transition. So on days when if a men misses time or Tari Eason misses time, and that's the other thing I'm concerned about. It's just like KD was healthy last year, and some of his injuries have kind of been more freakish injuries rather than just sort of like overuse type of stuff. But it's hard to imagine him playing more than 60-65 games. I don't know if you even want him to. And then what happens to the team? You're kind of without him. Are you back in kind of that 500 land like they were without VanVleet? I'd like to think they'd be better than that, but I think part of why I'm only predicting 52 is because I think when KD misses time, the offense could really struggle.
Absolutely. No, I mean, like somebody has to be able to fill that offensive void when KD, inevitably misses some time. And I think that, one of the things that this Rockets team does have working for it, even after the Fred VanVleet injury, once they get DFS back, that is, but they do have a significant amount of depth. And I do think that if they're smart about it, what you don't want to see happen is have KD playing, 35, 36, 37 minutes a night and really pushing the envelope with him on a nightly basis to the point where he's only able to play that 60 to 65 games, because you'd be much better off if you're, being a little bit more conservative with his minutes on a nightly basis, getting him a little bit lower, somewhere in that 33, 34, 35 minutes max per night. And then if you can squeeze an extra 5 to 7 games out of KD and get him in that 70-ish territory, which last season, hell, he could have broken 70 games last year if the Suns didn't just shut him down for the season. Like they had nothing to play for at the end of the day. Like he had that ankle injury that he was ready to come back from, and they were just like, yeah, just stay out. Like it didn't matter anymore. So he could have hit 70 last year, or like close to it. It might have been like 68, 69 games or something like that. So if the Rockets can get close to 70 games out of KD, I think they'll be able to survive. And if they just, even if they just tread water and go 500 in the non-KD games, I think I've got them still a little bit further north than that. I think I'm going to have them at about like 54, 55 wins, just because they punted on the last 3 games of the season last year anyways, because they had the 2 seeds sewn up. So operating under that assumption, like they could have very easily finished with 55 last season, and they just gave up on the final 3 games, and they'll be a much better closing team this go around with KD. So they dropped so many close games that they had no business losing, games that they were legitimately leading at times, sometimes even by double digits in the fourth quarter. And then just watching these like horrendous collapses. They had back-to-back just awful collapses against the Wolves and the Heat in literally back-to-back games at one point in the middle of the season last year on their home court. And that was the game I don't know if you remember, that was the game where Tyler Harrow and Ime Thompson got into it, and Tyler Harrow got ragdolled across Toyota Center.
Yes.
But like those games, they shouldn't have lost. They were in firm control of those games, and they just melted down the stretch of the fourth quarter. Like those things aren't going to happen nearly as frequently when you can just, hey, the offense is bogging down, and hey, this other team is catching back up. Just give the ball to KD for a couple possessions, and he'll get you a couple middies and like get things back on track. So
Yeah, we'll see. Our numbers had them, which account for the score when you enter the clutch. So it's obviously if you're up when you enter the last 5 minutes within 5 points, you have a better chance of winning. But we had them losing 0.7 games more than expected in the clutch. They're 26-18, but they entered the clutch with a lot of wins. So yeah, we'll see whether that becomes a factor. I'm not necessarily painting that in that much. So yeah, you might give me an official number here, 54, 55.
I'm going to go with 55. 55.
All right. The hungry spreadsheet has claimed another number. So you're going to 55 wins. I'm going to 52. And yeah, a season ago, you were much closer than I was. You had actually had them with 47. I had them with 42. I was way off. So yeah, give me, let us know where we can keep up with everything you're doing this season.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as always, Nate, thanks so much for having me on the show. It's always a ton of fun being able to talk basketball with you, man. You can track me down over at Locked on Rockets. We do the show 5 days a week and sometimes more, depending on what's going on with the team. And also, I'm on Locked on NBA Friday, so catch me there every Friday.
All right. Thanks again, Jackson. And thanks to all of you for listening. And we will be back very shortly with more on Dunc'd On and Dunc'd On Prime in our season outlook series.